What follows is part of a documentary that's in the works. Because of the urgency of this topic, we're releasing pieces of the video as they are completed. The previous portion that we released is on the subject of testing. And what we've discovered from that is that the testing is of dubious scientific validity at best and may be entirely fraudulent. Why does this matter? It matters because in previous Tony Fauci operations, people were prescribed drugs based on the testing they received. And in this video, you're going to see the outcome of those drugs that were recommended and promoted heavily by Tony Fauci.
When I was looking at this data with our team the other night, it was reminiscent of 34 years ago in 1986 when we were struggling for drugs for HIV, and we had nothing. And there was a lot of anecdotal reports about things that maybe they worked, maybe not. People were taking different kinds of drugs. And we did the first randomized placebo-controlled trial with AZT, which turned out to give an effect that was modest.
In 1987, the war on AIDS took another drastic turn for the worse. AZT, a toxic chemotherapy deemed too poisonous for cancer treatment, was approved to treat symptomatic and asymptomatic HIV patients in an attempt to kill the virus that causes AIDS. AZT is a DNA chain terminator, a poison designed to randomly destroy the DNA synthesis of reproducing cells. It was initially developed to treat leukemia victims, but after animal testing, the FDA determined that it was too toxic for use in human beings and banned it. But in 1987, when the AIDS scare hit its height, the FDA was pressured into approving the drug for use for the first time in human beings, even for people who were healthy and showed no sign of AIDS. AZT is highly mutagenic, meaning that it destroys the genes in cells and has been shown to cause cancer in rodents. It targets the bone marrow, where B lymphocyte blood cells are being made. These are the very cells an AIDS patient needs most for immunity. AZT destroys randomly bone marrow, kidneys, liver, intestines, muscle tissue, the brain, and central nervous system. Peter Duesberg claims AZT actually causes AIDS itself.
AZT does directly causing AIDS-defining diseases. You know, AIDS is a lot of the things, but it doesn't cause Kaposi sarcoma, I think, but it does cause immunodeficiency. It was designed to do that. It was designed to kill human cells. In fact, the manufacturer says that specifically that it can cause AIDS-like diseases. And the manufacturer, that is Spirits Wellcome, says it is often difficult to distinguish adverse events possibly associated with pseudobudin or pseudobudin administration, which is AZT, from underlying signs of HIV disease. In other words, even they acknowledge, not just Duisberg, that AZT causes AIDS or AIDS-defining diseases.
Whenever you have clear-cut evidence that a drug works, you have an ethical obligation to immediately let the people who are in the placebo group know so that they could have access. And all of the other trials that are taking place now have a new standard of care. So we would have normally waited several days until the data gets further, dot the I and cross the T. But the data are not going to change. Some of the numbers may change a little, but the conclusion will not change.
In his book, Poison by Prescription, journalist John Lawrenson explains how AZT tests conducted by the FDA and Burroughs Wellcome, the manufacturer, were scientifically sloppy and outright fraudulent. During the experiments, patients taking AZT became anemic, suffered low white blood cell counts accompanied by vomiting. Over half had to have blood transfusions. 20% were transfused several times. Despite a warning by FDA toxicology analyst Harvey Chernoff that AZT not be approved, the FDA was pressured by AIDS activist organizations to lift the ban, and hundreds of thousands of people began taking AZT, even though AZT cannot cure AIDS and is only supposed to slow down the progression.
The mortality rate trended towards being better in the sense of less deaths in the Remdesivir group. 8% versus 11% in the placebo group. It has not yet reached statistical significance, but the data needs to be further analyzed.
The logic behind AZT treatment is flawed, even if one believes HIV causes AIDS, because HIV only infects about 1 T cell in 1,000, 999 healthy T cells must die to kill the one cell that is infected, and this can only happen early on before HIV becomes dormant and is still making DNA. Yet AIDS patients are given AZT for months, on into years, randomly destroying DNA in all parts of the body. AZT is expensive and costs between $8,000 and $12,000 a year, most of which is paid for directly or indirectly by the taxpayer. Burroughs Wellcome, now Glaxo Wellcome, the manufacturer, has generated sales over $1 billion a year with AZT. Because of rules allowed by the FDA, a bottle of AZT that costs about $5 to make can be sold for over $500 as a prescription, and much of this markup is being subsidized by the taxpayer.
The treatment causes a very similar condition we would expect from an AIDS patient. That's why nobody noticed that there was something wrong with the treatment.
I remember in 1992, after I first tested positive, I became involved in an organization called Women at Risk. There were 11 of us at the time on the board and involved in the group. All of us except 3 were on the medications. In the year and a half that I was involved with Women at Risk, every single woman in that organization on the drugs died. Every single one, except the 3 of us who weren't taking them.
We weren't just given handfuls of AZT, we demanded it.
AZT, where is your humanity?
We considered the FDA not giving us these things as being anti-gay instead of being responsible. And so we went and we lobbied and we pushed for all these things, and we didn't think clearly about what it was we were asking for. It's like that saying, be careful what you ask for, it may come to pass.
Whenever you have clear-cut evidence that a drug works, you have an ethical obligation to immediately let the people who are in the placebo group know so that they could have access. And all of the other trials that are taking place now have a new standard of care. So we would have normally waited several days until the data gets further, dot the I and cross the T. But the data are not going to change. Some of the numbers may change a little, but the conclusion will not change.
ACT UP wanted to speed up the approval process for new drugs.
One of our greatest demonstrations and most famous was at the FDA. And it was over 1,000 demonstrators, almost all people with HIV, demanding to be heard.
I know that there are drugs out there that can save my life, and I want to know why they're not being tested more quickly.
I began to get beyond the rhetoric and the theater of the demonstrations and to really listen to what it is that they were saying. So I invited a group of them up to my conference room, and we spent a couple of hours talking about their concerns. And again, it just confirmed in my own mind that most of their concerns were really quite valid.
So to explain this for people that might be new to this particular kind of fraud, here's how it works. You create a fake activist group to push an agenda seemingly on behalf of society or an oppressed minority, when in fact you're controlling that group for your own purposes. Now, does that mean that everybody who was ever a member of ACT UP or ever went to a demonstration was in on it, in on the game? And the answer is no, because part of the game of creating these fake groups is also to attract legitimate people, mislead them, and weaponize them. And that's exactly what the drug companies did with ACT UP. Now, the question is, were they playing Tony Fauci, or was Tony Fauci playing along? Let's take a close look at an in-depth narrative he gave about his experience with ACT UP. Watch his body language, and you tell me.
Very early on in the course of this pandemic, the activists were making extremely good points about the uniqueness of this, the need to do more, the need to be less rigid in our regulatory approaches towards the approval and testing of new drugs, and the rigidity and lack of flexibility in how we design clinical trials, all of which were the classical way to approach drug development, therapeutic developments, clinical trials, and FDA approval. They wanted to get our attention, so they would do it in a very theatrical way, and they scared a lot, because for the most part, the scientific community and the regulatory community are conservative. And I say conservative, I don't mean conservative in an ideological, political way, but conservative in their approach towards science. It's nice that people are interested who are not scientists, but leave them out of it and lets us scientists make the decision. So they didn't pay much attention to the activists. I, for one reason or other, began reading intensively what they were writing, and even though when they were demonstrating and closing down Wall Street and invading St. Patrick's Cathedral and doing things like that, looking very eccentric and scary to some people, I try to phase that out and just listen to what they said and read what they wrote, and they were making perfect sense. So since I was always out there as a government official, they equated me, my face, my name, with the federal government. So they began to demonstrate against the NIH. And right here on our campus, they, came in, invaded the campus, smoked bombs, wanting to get arrested. And I made probably the best decision in my interaction with community, is that I agreed with what they were saying.
We weren't just given handfuls of AZT, we demanded it. We didn't think clearly about what it was we were asking for. It's like that saying, be careful what you ask for, it may come to pass.
The Wellcome Foundation, UK manufacturer of AZT, saw its shares spiral upwards. AZT was to be the new wonder drug. Then, in 1989, after further trials were terminated early in the United States because results looked promising, it was announced that AZT could be used not only on people with AIDS diseases, but in a much larger group, with HIV and low immune cell counts, but no other symptoms. Wellcome's shares soared to new heights, adding £1.4 billion to the company's UK stock market value in one day. Before a drug is licensed for use, it normally has to undergo animal toxicity studies and clinical trials in humans. No long-term animal studies were completed when AZT was licensed. The clinical studies in humans called Phase 2, which led to the licensing of AZT, were financed by Wellcome. They were presented as complying with the only reliable scientific test for a drug, double-blind studies, and published in the New England Journal of Medicine in July 1987.
The study fell apart. I mean, it bombed in so many ways. I showed the article, I wrote on it to my colleagues in survey research, and they were absolutely struck dumb. They could not believe the levels of incompetence that were there at all different levels, including things that are purely mechanical, but like the ability to design an appropriate questionnaire form. But yes, of course, a drug which is supposed to be given for the rest of somebody's life, if you have something tested for only a few weeks, you have a very poor idea of what to expect from it. Especially the Boston study, they would claim someone was in much longer than was claimed on the case report forms. And this meant that simply the doctors received a great deal more money. But far more important than this was the reporting of the adverse effects, the toxicities. And this was, the heart of what the study was to measure, that it was safe. And there were, many of their patients would have died from the toxicities of AZT if they had not been given emergency blood transfusions. This is serious adverse effect. It means literally that they would have died from the poison. And yet the case report forms, which showed up eventually as official data, they would report no adverse effects. I mean, this is a type of dishonesty. It's hard to go any further than that. Well, the most outrageous case, I forget which one it was, but was someone who had already been taking AZT, which a few people could. You know, they wanted the new miracle drug, and they were able to get it before it was approved for marketing. And he was entered as a patient in the placebo group, even though he was still taking AZT. He dropped out almost immediately, but continued to take AZT, and then he died. And they called him a death in the placebo group. I mean, it's hard to cheat any more than that. Of those who were given AZT, they all suffered really severe side effects. Side effect is misleading, toxicities. But a number of them would very definitely have died from anemia, which in the review of animal studies, AZT causes anemia in every species of animal that's ever been studied, including human beings. But they would have died if they had not been given emergency blood transfusions. And yet, according to the official data, the case report forms, these people had no adverse, reactions. The one single most unforgivable thing, there was cheating. There's no reason to believe that Boston, one of 12 centers, was the only one in which cheating took place. It's very likely that the same cheating, maybe even worse, took place in all 11 others. It's just that Boston happened to get an honest investigative team that did their work. Many of the others were going to be investigated thoroughly, and then they said, oh, we just don't have time, so we don't know. But to me, the single worst thing is that they deliberately used data they knew were false. That's the one single thing that can never be forgiven.
And we did the first randomized placebo-controlled trial with AZT, which turned out to give an effect that was modest.
From scientific meetings, from these conferences, from my personal contacts with people in the field, I can tell you that I've found no evidence anywhere that people live longer, better lives who take these anti-HIV drugs, these protease inhibitors, either alone or in cocktails, as compared to a similar group of HIV-positive people who do not take these drugs. So I do not know where the evidence is for the claims that you see in the New York Times or in CNN or wherever you see it, that people are living longer, better lives as a consequence of taking these drugs.
There's two types of antiviral drugs. One is the AZT style drug, also known as nucleoside analogs. What these drugs do essentially is they just kill cells. The other type of antiviral drug, these are the protease inhibitors, and what they do is they interfere with the activities of an enzyme called protease. Some viruses have proteases, but so do healthy human cells. Either style of drug, you give it to a human, and you either kill or harm healthy cells.
The results of the early AZT trial on people with full-blown AIDS appeared to be so convincing that the drug was given a new fast-track approval by the United States Food and Drug Administration before any long-term toxicity trials in animals had been completed.
These new regulations specifically will have special criteria that would apply to immediately life-threatening conditions, recognizing that such patients are willing to accept the greater risk than that which normally would be the case.
The Wellcome Foundation, UK manufacturer of AZT, saw its shares spiral upwards. AZT was to be the new wonder drug. Then, in 1989, after further trials were terminated early in the United States because results looked promising, it was announced that AZT could be used not only on people with AIDS diseases, but in a much larger group, with HIV and low immune cell counts, but no other symptoms. Wellcome's shares soared to new heights, adding £1.4 billion to the company's UK stock market value in one day.
Commercial interests are definitely part of the problem here. And it's also our collective inability or challenge to say, all this time, all these years, all these lives, all these billions and billions of dollars, can we just stop a second and go back to the very beginning and make sure we've got this right? I mean, that is so hard to do.
People are so invested in the lives that they can't trust
people don't even know it's a lie. I mean, you know, it's not so much a lie as business as usual. I mean, having been in business for a long time, I was in advertising for a long time, and then I had this very successful clothing company. The business of a business is to be in business. You need to find new markets. You need to find new customers. You need to increase your profit margins. If that means going offshore, if that means, you know, taking over new territories, if it means coming up with new products that more people want. And the ideal of every business is to have a government mandate for your product.
The antiviral drugs are chemotherapies. They're all based on chemotherapies that have been developed 30 years ago, long before AIDS was known, to kill human cells. Chemotherapy is restricted to a few months in the hope the cancer dies before you die.
If you started taking any other chemotherapeutic agent for the rest of your life, it would be that agent probably that killed you. You know, when you give chemotherapy to somebody with cancer, you give them a round of it for maybe 14 days or a few days. Hopefully you're not going to kill the patient. You're going to kill the cancer. The patient's going to survive. But you don't keep giving it to him until he dies, because he certainly will.
We went from nothing, not even knowing what the virus was, to discovering the virus, developing drugs, and then having a phenomenal response. The epidemic went from a few gay men to now, today, 78 million people having been infected, 39 million deaths, 35 million people living with HIV, and the epidemic still rages with over 2 million new infections each year.
They're taking the show to the third world, and they're not only giving AZT to what will probably be millions of women in the third world, whether they're HIV positive or not, but they're also insisting that they stop breastfeeding and start formula feeding.
Mother's milk, which pediatricians around the world will tell you is the healthiest food that a newborn can have because of the immunological properties in mother's milk, that women should in fact cease breastfeeding their young. Now this to me seems something more than just a crime. This is absolutely diabolical.
I can't imagine that it'll work out any other way than that you're going to just see tens, maybe hundreds of thousands, maybe even more babies dying. And they'll probably say they died of AIDS no matter what happens. So nobody will even be held accountable this time. Oh, here's the one thing they're doing. So they can demonstrate that this has nothing to do with any particular formula company making money off of this situation. The WHO or UNAIDS or whoever it is insisting that the formula gets shipped in bottles without labels.
We haven't looked carefully at the facts. We've been told numbers ranging from 5 million to 25 million Africans have HIV and that there's going to be an enormous amount of death. But when you actually go to Africa and you interview the physicians working there, you find that these are presumptive diagnoses.
One of the things that is important to emphasize from the outset is that the definition of an AIDS case on the African continent differs decisively from what constitutes an AIDS case, say, in North America or Western Europe. A definition was arrived at as a result of a World Health Organization sponsored conference in October of 1985. What resulted was what's known as the Bangui definition. The Bangui definition of an AIDS case in Africa is based on 4 clinical symptoms. The clinical symptoms are a high fever, a persistent cough, loose stools for 30 days, and a 10% loss of body weight over a 2-month period. By that definition, a Western researcher like myself has had AIDS. But having gotten on a plane and flown back to California, I'm not considered, of course, an AIDS case. So I think it's important to keep that in mind whenever one looks at the data, the epidemiological data, about what exactly we're counting when it comes to AIDS.
The epidemic went from a few gay men to now, today, 78 million people having been infected, 39 million deaths, 35 million people living with HIV, and the epidemic still rages with over 2 million new infections each year. So this is a list of the drugs that have been developed for HIV, and it's extraordinary that I went from 1981 through the middle of the 1990s, taking care of people without adequate therapy. And then as the years went by, from 1987 through the mid-90s, we developed these 30 drugs, and this I consider one of the most important transformative discoveries in biological sciences.